What a good writer should do. Let's think about this. Well, obviously a good writer should know the language. And I'm not only talking about speaking the language, but also knowing all the basic tools of work when you write your story. How to use the sentences, how to use attributions, how to include quotes, when to include them, how to use the story structure, what story structures exist overall, what types of leads and story structures are appropriate for different topics, for different genres, and so on. So all of that involves knowing the language as your basic tool of work. The second element is knowing the subject. So this basically means that no matter what it is that you're writing about, you need to do research before you write. And as a reporter, you will often come across topics that maybe you never really had to work with before. And that's when this part really becomes very important, when you have to do your research. Because if you don't know what you're writing about, your readers are not going to know either. And that's just one endless chain of causes and consequences. The third element, write it down. It sounds easy. Just sit and write a story, right? That's all it takes. But throughout this semester, I'm sure that many of you will find that this is actually the most difficult part. You spoke to your sources, and it was interesting and exciting. You had great conversations with your sources. You got all the quotes. You recorded them. You took your pictures. You created your captions. You did your background research. You know everything you need to know to write a story and put it together. And now what's next? Well, you have to sit down and write it. And sometimes that's the most difficult part. And we'll talk more about writer's block as a phenomenon this semester. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that editing and rewriting is a pretty significant, it's a process that takes a significant amount of time. So you should not leave the editing part till the last moment, because sometimes the editing part actually contributes the most value to the final product. Copy editing and rewriting is actually an essential part of a mass media practitioner's job. Saying that, let's move on to the next slide. So knowing the language, the first element. Of course, it includes grammar, punctuation, and spelling, but there is so much more to it. And what I mean by that is it's not enough to just make sure you don't have any errors in your story. But it also means that if you know the language, you know what words are appropriate. You make right choices when it comes to efficient headlines, efficient leads, efficient kicker quotes. So choosing all those elements of your story wisely, choosing the right words, and having a diverse vocabulary, it's also a part of that. So let's think about the size of our vocabulary. Most people have a vocabulary of about 5,000 to 6,000 words. Shakespeare's vocabulary, for example, was around 30,000 words. So as you can guess, he became famous for his writing because he really knew the language. I actually looked it up, and I found out that there are different estimates that researchers did trying to evaluate how diverse his vocabulary was. And I found all kinds of evaluations, actually. But 30,000 words is what I found on average. Some sources list way more than that. Some sources list a significantly smaller number of words. But overall, it's pretty much a known fact that Shakespeare's vocabulary was known as one of the most diverse when it comes to professional writers or people that did writing for a living. Let's compare it to an average vocabulary of an average person. So at the age of 1, most people know at least 50 words. Maybe they don't, not all of them are capable of saying them yet, but they can recognize those words. At the age of 3, most people know on average around 1,000 words. Then an average person is somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000. Then there was a study that I found that showed that the Wall Street Journal, all reports, news reports, and news stories all together, had a diverse vocabulary of about 18,000 words. And then compared to Shakespeare, that had reportedly about 30,000 words in his vocabulary. So clearly, as we age, of course, our vocabulary grows. But it also does when we do a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of editing, a lot of reporting. So it's hard work to make sure your vocabulary is diverse enough and it's developed enough. And it's pretty much a lifelong work, improving your vocabulary, which is essential for any writer. So let's move on to the next slide. Another part of it is the routine of writing. Writing is actually a pretty difficult routine. Sitting down and getting it done, as I said, it's actually one of the hardest parts of this work. And just to compare, let's take a look at some of the obstacles that professional writers have faced previously in history. So Fyodor Dostoevsky, for example, that is primarily known in the West for this novel Crime and Punishment. He was a gambler, so he had a serial problem with that, and as a result, he accumulated a lot of debt. To be able to pay for his debts, he had to sell new novel contracts to publishers, and as a result, he had to write so fast because to be able to fulfill all those contracts to pay off his gambling debts. And he actually wrote a novel called The Gambler in 1866. And because it's sort of ironic, the novel is called The Gambler, and it's the novel that he wrote in order to pay off his gambling debt. He wrote it in 26 days. He wrote a whole novel in less than a month. So this really reflects his sort of writing routine. As a professional writer, he struggled a lot with being able to write fast. And he often experienced regret because he felt that he could write so much better and so much more if he had enough time to think about it. But of course, this is the feeling that most writers experience. It always feels like there's not enough time before the deadline to do it the way you want it, exactly that way. But the reality is that the deadlines will always exist, and we have to consider them. So that's just one example. And Dostoevsky actually sometimes would hire someone to write it down faster for him as he just pronounces the sentences that he wanted to be in this book. And that's sometimes how he would get it done in just 26 days. Another example, Jack Kerouac, the author of On the Road, he wrote this novel in 1957 in just 21 days. And in this case, it was just a writing routine, discipline, and strict schedule. In most modern newsrooms, if it's a 24/7 news brief kind of newsroom, writers there sometimes have to write up to 5 to 7 news pieces in an hour, if we're talking about news briefs. And when I was working in a daily newspaper, we would write about 2 full stories a day for daily newspaper's website, or some days it would be even 3 full stories, or 5 to 7 brief news pieces an hour. So as you can see, it's quite a fast speed of production. It's not easy, and definitely writing requires a lot of discipline.